Let's talk about what we're here to talk about, generational equity. You're applying these great powers of predicting the markets and what's going to happen in the world. Can we get the slides started so Stan can take us through what we're looking at? And Stan, I do want to thank you for not spending all the money on graphics. Okay.
You got the Berkeley one, and it's not my fault, it's your fault. I sent you the USC one. It says September 26th, Jeff Canada and Stan Druckenmiller. So
okay, well,
nice job, David.
Thank you. Attention to detail. As an ex-lawyer, I just sunk. Go to the stage is yours, please. Touche.
Let's go to the first slide, please. The first thing I'd like to say, because I have a message for the students, which is Jeff and I grew up in a time when not only were the assassinations and the other problems in our country he talked about occurring, there was something called the Vietnam War. And it was pretty clear if you were in high school that there was a real threat that in your very near future you were going over in the rice paddies getting bullets shot at you and possibly threatened with death. And because of that, the young people in the United States united, started a movement, and we brought down a president. We brought down Lyndon Johnson. And really, I think if you look behind the lines, we sent Mr. Nixon on his way too, although he certainly helped himself into that exit. But I'm going to present some stuff to you tonight, and I really want you to listen carefully because I think your generation faces a clear and present danger. It's not as obvious as it was with us where we're facing possible death, but it's very, very serious. And instead of them blowing up your house overnight, your house may be eaten by termites. And it doesn't matter whether it blew up overnight or it took 15 or 20 years, because you still lose your house. And I am hoping to inform you tonight, I can't start a movement. That's up to you. I barely even know how to use Facebook. In fact, I'm not on it if you're looking for me. But let's just go through what's been going on, which really has been 40 years of wealth transfer from the current elderly generation, from you to them, and from your future children to them. And it's about to get a whole lot worse because of the baby boom and the demographics. The share they've been taking from your generation, they're about to be a lot more of them taking it. So this chart here is simply federal government budget outlays, the percent going back many, many years, as you can see. And when Jeff and I were in high school, about 28% of federal outlays went to what we would call transfer payments or entitlements. That number over the last 40 years has gone to 68%. Next slide, please. So where has that money gone? Well, it certainly hasn't gone to the young. On the blue line is children age 15 and under, and in the red line is the elderly. And as you can see, the share of government spending going to the elderly has completely rocketed since 1960. In fact, if you go back to 1960, about 20% of budget outlays were spent on children and the elderly. Those numbers in total now are 50% on the elderly and 15% on children. And when you hear the kind of stuff Jeff was talking about earlier, that's frankly a tragedy. Next slide, please.
Here you go, if you want to look here.
Okay. I'd like to look up there. It feels more real. These are U.S. poverty rates. And as you can see, back in the period I'm talking about, when we started out, the elderly were the poverty rate was about 30%. Because of a lot of the government spending and other programs, the poverty rate for the elderly has come down to 9%. And look, I think this is a magnificent accomplishment. I think it's one we should all be very, very proud of and very happy about. The problem is, look at what's happened to the poverty rate of children. It's actually risen from 20% to 23% over that period of time. So when you hear in the United States how we've cured poverty and how all the progress we've made, it's only been made with the elderly. Our children's poverty rate is currently higher than it was 30 or 40 years ago. Next slide, please. And just to show you how unusual that is, Jeff talked about how he wanted to grow up in a fair America. Look at where the USA stands among the top 35 countries in children's poverty rate. We are second. Given the wealth we have, this is a disgrace. Next chart, please. So this is a little complicated, and if I was from USC, I could probably explain it better, but for a guy from Bowdoin, I'll see what I can do. So the y-axis is age, and the x-axis is percentage of spending, which I'll get to in a minute. But let's go back to 1960. And if you look at the chart, if those colored lines went up to 1, 100% of a 45-year-old's average income in society would be spent. Why are we using 45? Because 45 is sort of the nexus of what the American workforce is. So to take their average income, that's a good representative level. So if you go back to 1960, let's go to, say, the 40-year-old. The 40-year-old was spending about 65% of what an average 45-year-old made, and obviously saving the rest of it. However, a 90-year-old was spending about 50% of what the average 45-year-old made in 1960. Okay, fast forward to today. The 40-year-old is still spending about 60% of what a 45-year-old makes. The 90-year-old, by the way, who is unemployed, is spending 140% of what the 45-year-old makes. So back in 1960, a 40-year-old used to spend 40 or 50% more than a 90-year-old. Now a 90-year-old spends almost twice what a 40-year-old spends. This just shows you the huge shift in wealth and obviously the spending benefits that have gone to the elderly. And you can see where a lot of it's going in pink and in yellow. That's public and private health spending. You can't even find in the pink in 1960. Next slide, please. So there's a few consequences. There's a few reasons for this consequence, but this is an astounding chart, and I think particularly every young person in the room should look at this very carefully. This is the change in net worth for certain age groups between 1983 and 2010. And it's pretty wild because the average 30-year-old in 1983 was worth more than the average 30-year-old in 2010 is. Think about that. Over a 30-year period, the net worth for the 30-year-old of each period has actually dropped. Now, I'm not going to tell you that the 30-year-old today isn't better off. I mean, he's got iPad, he's got internet, there's a number of things. But his net worth has actually dropped, and my guess is that's never happened in the history of this country before. Now, look at the 75-year-old. A 75-year-old in 1983, and take the 75-year-old now, he's worth 150% more than the one in 1983 was. So over the same time period, the net worth of a 30-year-old has dropped, while the net worth of a 75-year-old has more than doubled. So if you're not getting the picture, we've had a massive transfer of wealth and spending toward the elderly the last 40 or 50 years. Next slide, please. Now, basically what I've shown you so far, imagine a pie, and the elderly used to eat this much of it, and now they're eating this much of it, and children and elderly used to eat about the same. Well, the problem is you're about to get a whole lot more eaters eating the pie than there were previously, and the reason is demographics. When World War II ended, a lot of people came back to the United States, and I guess abstinence, you know what that does. There was a whole lot of something going on that was making babies for a while, and if you look at the next 20 years, the birth rate basically averaged about 3.0 children per woman, and peaked in 1957 at 3.7. and that has dropped to 2 today. To put that in perspective, we have 100 million more people in America today than we had in 1957, but they made more babies in 1957 than we'll make in 2013. The consequence of this is pretty dire from an economic sense. Because 1947, you add 65 years, is 2012. For the next 22 years, 11,000 seniors are going to be added to those entitlement payrolls every day. Every day. In 2030, I know we're in California, but how many of you have been to Florida? Okay, in 2030, the average population in the United States is going to be older than the average population in Florida now. Kind of an ugly sight if you've been to Florida. You see the strollers today? You're going to see walkers in 2030. They're going to be everywhere. Next slide, please. Now, here's why this is so ugly. If you look, because of the demographics I just described, over the next 30 years, the 18 to 64 population is going to grow 17% because you guys aren't doing your job and having babies, okay? But the 65 and over is going to grow 102%. And what does that mean economically? It means today, the working age population, there's 4.71 workers for every oldster that they're working to support in the entitlement system. In 2030, there's only going to be 2.4. So literally the number of working people that are there to support the elderly is going to drop in half. Next slide, please. So here's the problem. In red, you have outlays, and again, this is primarily driven by the entitlements and the demographic boom we just described. In blue, you have revenues, and in blue is basically where tax rates have yielded in the last 40 years, and that's about 18% of revenues. As the red continues to climb, the gap between those continues to grow. Now, if I lent Jeff some money, and he agreed he was going to pay me back at a future date, I think most people in the room would agree he has a debt, okay? Well, in the United States, we have something like a payroll tax. I'm sure some of you are already paying it, but David, Jeff, and I are paying it. And we're paying a payroll tax, which means we're giving it to the government, and when we're 65, they promise to start paying us that money back. Well, you know how the government accounts for that? They don't call it a debt, they call it revenue. So if you took those debts and put them on the government balance sheet, next slide, please. The 17 trillion, it says 12, but that's not counting the money that the Fed has bought from the Treasury. So you have all these scaremongers running around talking about 17 trillion in debt. If you did the accounting that they do for any company in America, except for maybe Enron and Fannie and Freddie a few years ago, the debt today is not 17 trillion, it's 205 trillion. All I've done here is take that money that's off balance sheet, those payments that are promised to me, you, and Jeff when we come of age, and put it on the balance sheet, and therein lies the problem. So that fiscal gap is 205 trillion, and guess who's going to pay for that? Next slide, please. The young people. So this money that my generation has been getting, this transfer that's been going on for 30 or 40 years, I cited the number in the beginning, we are actually, because we've had this great lobbying arm called the AARP, we are actually going to be ahead of the game. We're going to get $327,000 more in benefits than we put in, but the unborn, my great-grandchildren, I'm not too worried about them, by the way. Talking about mine.
I'm worried about mine. His are going to be okay.
They're going to be net payers of $420,000. So when you hear President Obama say, we got to do something fair and balanced, and we don't want to do this on the back of seniors, how can they look you in the straight face when there's a $700,000 inequity between today's seniors versus future seniors? And in the meantime, the Republicans on their side they're talking about all these great cuts they're doing. They're not touching entitlements. And this is where the money is. As I said earlier, they're cutting NIH grants, they're cutting Head Start, they're cutting food stamps. The only thing that's not being touched is the only place there's any real money, which is entitlements. And I think you can see it's not exactly a fair picture.
When we say entitlements, you're talking about Social Security and Medicare and the largest obligations.
And a bigger part of Medicaid than you would think. So that first slide, which was 67%, when you net out Medicaid and unemployment benefits and like that, about 51% goes to the elderly. So I've presented a pretty static picture and then a dynamic picture. But let's just look at 2013 and look 10 years forward after they've already taken this big piece of pie. Okay, so here's what's going to happen. The next 10 years in the CBO budget, endorsed by the administration, spending goes up $1 trillion. Okay, I'm okay with that. Of the $1 trillion, $875 billion goes to Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. How much do you think goes to children? $6 billion. And that includes what they're going to get from Medicaid because education spending is going down, so you net that out. $875 billion when they've already been at the trough for 40 years relative to children, and $6 billion in the next 10 years. This whole budget fight is a fraud. This is where the money is, not where you're hearing about in the newscasts. Next chart, please. So one of the things you'll hear out there is this debt bomb doesn't hit for 10 or 15 years. First of all, I don't even think you need to worry about a debt bomb to justify fixing this thing. It's just grossly unfair, as I've shown the inequity. But if you want to talk about why you need to act now as opposed to later, because there's plenty of pundits out there who say, well, the problem really doesn't hit for 10 or 15 years. That's when the demographic storm gets big enough, we get overwhelmed on the debt. It's not really true. That fiscal gap I showed of $205 trillion, you could actually fix it. Well, not really, but here's what you'd have to do to fix it. If you raised all taxes 55%, payroll, income, capital gains, dividends, raise them all 55%, the problem would go away. Supposedly, the economy would probably tank and then you'd have another problem. Or you could cut all spending 36%, all of it. President Obama's limousine, military, transfer payments, everything, cut it 36%. But that's not why I've got this chart up here. What I've got up here is to show you, if you wait 30 years, you don't have to raise taxes 55% to solve the problem. You have to raise them 71.6%. And you wouldn't have to cut expenditures 36%. You'd have to cut them 44%. Very simple. Anybody here have a credit card and you pay 18% on? If you wait 3 or 4 years, you pay more money than if you pay it now. That's exactly the analogy here. So this gap is so big, the sooner we address it, the better, and the later we address it, the bigger the problem becomes. Next slide, please. This is the final slide I'm going to talk about, but this is probably the most heart-wrenching of them all to me. The red line is the first chart I showed you. This is government outlays, payments to individuals, basically transfer payments. The blue line is investments. Investments includes education, infrastructure, and R&D by the government. Now, I understand I'm at the only university in the United States that has a lot of Republicans in it, and I know a lot of Republicans aren't too high on government investments, but the blue line, let me tell you what came of the blue line the last 40 or 50 years. Under Eisenhower, the interstate highway system. Pretty good deal when you think about the transportation, everything that goes across it. Oh, there's another thing that came out of it, GPS. Anybody here use GPS? The internet, no, Al Gore didn't invent it, but it was funded, all the R&D was funded by a government program. NIH grants, the Human Genome Project, all these were government investments. Whether you like them or not, I think we can all agree transfer payments to the elderly who are already doing, as I showed you, awfully well, to cut out these kind of investments and the stuff we mentioned in Jeff's programs is a pretty tough deal. So
Well done, Professor Druckenmiller. Let's